Welcome to Sleepy SpongeBob!
They used to say Patrick's home was nothing more than a rock, just a heavy, round stone sitting quietly on the sand, casting its shadow against the shifting currents. To most, it looked like emptiness, a hollow place without furniture, without decoration, without the things one expects from a home. But if you lingered long enough, if you allowed yourself to sink into the slow rhythm of the sea, you would notice something different. The rock was not empty at all. It was filled with silence, with stillness, with a kind of gentle space that made even the busiest thoughts drift away like bubbles rising to the surface. And perhaps that was why Patrick chose it. Or maybe the rock chose him. He was not always understood by the world around him. From the very beginning, Patrick had a way of seeing things sideways. Not wrong, but softer, slower, tilted in directions others often overlooked. While some creatures rushed about the reef, chasing food, building homes, chasing dreams, Patrick simply stayed. He rested. He watched the light drift down in broken shafts through the water. He listened to the sound of sand shifting beneath his body. He breathed in the slow hum of the ocean, and without knowing why, he felt at peace. When Patrick was small, younger than anyone remembers, younger even than SpongeBob's earliest days of laughter, he had already found the strange calmness of that rock. At first, it was a place to hide from the rush of the ocean. He would curl beneath it, little arms tucked close, and close his eyes. He was not hiding from danger, not exactly, but from the noise of the sea. The tides could roar and tumble, but under the rock there was only a gentle hush. It was in that hush that Patrick began to grow. You see, every creature has a kind of origin, a moment when the world first whispers to them who they are. For some it happens in storms or in journeys or in grand lessons. For Patrick, it happened in the quiet beneath the stone. He did not learn by listening to teachers or by chasing adventure. He learned by being still. He learned by noticing the faint tremor of shells clicking in the distance, by feeling the way the water cooled at night and warmed by day, by letting the silence seep into him until it became part of who he was. There were times when other creatures passed by, glancing at the rock, laughing softly. "There's nothing in there," they'd say. Just Patrick doing nothing again. But what they could not see was that Patrick was listening, always listening, to the ocean, to his own slow thoughts, to the way the world feels when you stop trying to force it into shape and instead let it unfold. As a young starfish, Patrick did not understand the difference between memory and dream. Some days he would wake and feel sure that he had spoken with the moon, that the stars had drifted down to whisper secrets into the sand. Other times he was certain that jellyfish had sung lullabies directly to his heart. Maybe those things happened, maybe they didn't. But in Patrick's world, it didn't matter. Dream and memory were stitched together like seaweed tangled in the tide, each thread wrapping softly around the other. One such dream stayed with him longer than most. He remembered floating upward as if the currents carried him toward the surface, though he had made no effort to swim. Above him, the waves shimmered with silver light, and beyond them, the stars were scattered like glittering shells on an endless shore. A voice, or perhaps only a feeling, told him, "You are small, and that is your gift." Small things notice what great things forget. When Patrick awoke, he was back beneath his rock, the same as always. But something in him carried that dream forward, like a pearl tucked quietly inside a clam. He did not understand it, but he carried it all the same. Years passed in their drifting, timeless way. Patrick grew, though not in the ordinary sense of learning skills or earning titles. His growth was slower, subtler, like the way coral spreads across the reef without anyone noticing, until one day it covers a stone entirely. He became a creature who found wonder in the overlooked, who laughed at things others missed, who carried forgetfulness like a lantern. not a flaw, but a blessing that allowed him to live without the heavy weight of yesterday pressing on his back. And always, his rock was there. The rock was not merely shelter. It was a teacher. It showed him that a home does not need to be filled with things to be full. It taught him that emptiness is only another word for space. Space for breathing, for dreaming, for resting, for waiting. Under that stone, Patrick did not feel lonely. He felt endless. There were evenings when the tide grew low and the water around him seemed quieter than usual. In those times, Patrick would peek out from beneath the rock and watch the shifting of the reef. Crabs scuttled sideways. Schools of fish glimmered like fleeting thoughts. Somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted, faint, bubbling, carried by currents from a yellow sponge's pineapple-shaped home. Patrick didn't yet know that this laughter would one day become the center of his life. He only knew that it felt familiar, like hearing a lullaby you can't quite remember, but somehow know. Sometimes, as he drifted towards sleep, Patrick would hum to himself. The tune was never the same twice, half forgotten, half invented. Little fragments of melody rose from his quiet heart, echoing softly in the hollow beneath the rock. It was not a song anyone else would recognize, but it was enough for him. Enough to remind him that the world did not need to be busy or loud to be full of meaning. Patrick's origin was not a grand beginning, not a clash of heroes or a spark of lightning. His beginning was softer, like the first ripple that spreads across still water when you drop a pebble. The kind of beginning you only notice if you are very still, very quiet, and very patient. And so when people asked what Patrick's story was, some said there was nothing to tell. But perhaps the greatest stories are not the ones filled with battles or treasures. Perhaps they are the ones that bloom slowly, like a secret garden beneath a stone. Patrick's story begins there, under the rock that wasn't empty. A story not of doing, but of being. Not of chasing, but of drifting. A story of someone who, without trying, carried the quiet wisdom of the tides inside him. And though he did not yet know it, the laughter in the distance was calling him toward the friendship that would shape the rest of his days. Patrick did not wake quickly in the mornings. The world unfolded for him slowly, as though the tides themselves knew to be gentle when passing over his rock. He would stretch his arms lazily, letting grains of sand slip through his fingers and blink at the way the ocean light swam across the ground. It was never quite the same twice, sometimes pale ribbons of silver, sometimes a warm golden haze, sometimes nothing but the faint shimmer of bubbles drifting past. To Patrick, these shifting lights were songs without words, and he had long since learned to listen. The ocean, after all, had a voice of its own. Beneath the constant hum of waves, beneath the clatter of shells and the busy shuffle of creatures, there was a deeper sound, a lullaby so soft you could only hear it when you were very still. Patrick knew this lullaby from childhood. It was not a melody sung in notes but in movements, the rise and fall of tides, the hush of current weaving through seagrass, the gentle knock of driftwood tapping against coral. To Patrick, this was the music of his world, and though he could never repeat it, he carried it inside him like a secret heartbeat. He had always been different in this way. Others spoke of what they built, what they achieved, what they remembered. Patrick spoke of the way water felt on his skin when he stopped moving. He spoke of the way silence seemed to glow if you stayed with it long enough. His words didn't always make sense to his neighbors, but they were not meant to. They were fragments of a song he did not know he was singing, and yet, for all his forgetfulness, Patrick never forgot the lullaby of the tides. When he was younger, he would float in open water, letting himself be carried wherever the currents decided. Sometimes this meant drifting far, into places where the reef grew dark and strange. Sometimes it meant circling endlessly until he ended up back beneath his rock again. But he never feared these wanderings. The ocean was not something he needed to conquer or understand. It was something to trust, something to rest in. It was on one such drifting day that Patrick first began to understand how deeply the ocean cared for him. He had been floating for hours, eyes half closed, body spread wide so the water held him like a cradle. He drifted past schools of fish, darting like quicksilver arrows, past forests of kelp swaying with slow grace, past shadows so large he chose not to think about them. And all the while the lullaby hummed through him, soft and steady, telling him he was safe. At some point, he could never say when, the world grew quiet. The fish scattered, the shadows pulled back, the water stilled around him, and in that stillness Patrick felt something he would remember forever. It was not a word, not a thought, but a presence, as though the ocean itself leaned close and wrapped him in a blanket made of currents and light. He did not know if he was dreaming, or if this was what it meant to truly listen. But from that day forward, whenever he felt lost, Patrick would close his eyes, breathe slowly, and let the lullaby guide him home.
Others did not always see this gift.
They laughed at his drifting, at his habit of staring too long at nothing, at his tendency to forget what had just been said. But Patrick's forgetfulness was not emptiness. It was release. He did not cling to words, to worries, to the endless chatter of the reef. He let them go the way the tide lets go of foam when it rolls back into the sea. That was why he could laugh so easily, why he could rest when others were restless, why he could forgive without needing an explanation. Still, even Patrick, wrapped in his quiet world, felt the ache of loneliness sometimes. The lullaby was beautiful, but it was only his. He longed in some unspoken way to share it. Not in words, those slipped from him too quickly, but in being, in presence, in the silent companionship of someone who understood that meaning lives in stillness as much as in speech. And that was when he began to notice the laughter in the distance. It was not the first time he had heard it, but this time it called to him differently. A bright, bubbling laughter that seemed to cut through the water like bells ringing in a dream. Patrick could not explain why it mattered, but he felt it reaching toward him, tugging gently at the edges of his quiet world. He would hear it in the mornings sometimes, drifting faintly through the reef as he stirred beneath his rock. He would hear it in the evenings, echoing through the coral when the ocean grew still. Each time it left behind an afterglow, the way light lingers after a star falls. Patrick did not know yet that this laughter belonged to SpongeBob. He only knew it felt like an answer, as though the lullaby of the tides had finally found a harmony. For now, Patrick remained beneath his stone, humming fragments of half-remembered songs, listening to the ocean breathe. But already the threads of two lives were drawing closer. His rock was no longer just a shelter. It was a stage being quietly prepared, waiting for the moment when laughter and stillness would meet and something new would begin. Patrick did not rush to meet it. He never rushed. The tides always carried him where he needed to go, and so he trusted them again, closing his eyes, letting the lullaby fill him, waiting for the gentle pull that would soon bring a friend into his life who would turn silence into song. And somewhere above him, in a pineapple house not far from the shore, the laughter rang out again, bright, unafraid, and destined to find him. Patrick did not wake quickly in the mornings. The world unfolded for him slowly, as though the tides themselves knew to be gentle when passing over his rock. He would stretch his arms lazily, letting grains of sand slip through his fingers, and blink at the way the ocean light swam across the ground. It was never quite the same twice, sometimes pale ribbons of silver, sometimes a warm golden haze, sometimes nothing but the faint shimmer of bubbles drifting past. To Patrick, these shifting lights were songs without words, and he had long since learned to listen. The ocean, after all, had a voice of its own. Beneath the constant hum of waves, beneath the clatter of shells and the busy shuffle of creatures, there was a deeper sound, a lullaby so soft you could only hear it when you were very still. Patrick knew this lullaby from childhood. It was not a melody sung in notes, but in movements, the rise and fall of tides, the hush of current weaving through seagrass, the gentle knock of driftwood tapping against coral. To Patrick, this was the music of his world, and though he could never repeat it, he carried it inside him like a secret heartbeat. He had always been different in this way. Others spoke of what they built, what they achieved, what they remembered. Patrick spoke of the way water felt on his skin when he stopped moving. He spoke of the way silence seemed to glow if you stayed with it long enough. His words didn't always make sense to his neighbors, but they were not meant to. They were fragments of a song he did not know he was singing. And yet, for all his forgetfulness, Patrick never forgot the lullaby of the tides. When he was younger, he would float in open water, letting himself be carried wherever the currents decided. Sometimes this meant drifting far, into places where the reef grew dark and strange. Sometimes it meant circling endlessly until he ended up back beneath his rock again. But he never feared these wanderings. The ocean was not something he needed to conquer or understand. It was something to trust, something to rest in. It was on one such drifting day that Patrick first began to understand how deeply the ocean cared for him. He had been floating for hours, eyes half closed, body spread wide so the water held him like a cradle. He drifted past schools of fish, darting like quicksilver arrows, past forests of kelp, swaying with slow grace, past shadows so large he chose not to think about them. And all the while, the lullaby hummed through him, soft and steady, telling him he was safe. At some point, he could never say when, the world grew quiet. The fish scattered. The shadows pulled back. The water stilled around him. And in that stillness, Patrick felt something he would remember forever. It was not a word, not a thought, but a presence, as though the ocean itself leaned close and wrapped him in a blanket made of currents and light. He did not know if he was dreaming or if this was what it meant to truly listen. But from that day forward, whenever he felt lost, Patrick would close his eyes, breathe slowly, and let the lullaby guide him home. Others did not always see this gift. They laughed at his drifting, at his habit of staring too long at nothing, at his tendency to forget what had just been said. But Patrick's forgetfulness was not emptiness. It was release. He did not cling to words, to worries, to the endless chatter of the reef. He let them go the way the tide lets go of foam when it rolls back into the sea. That was why he could laugh so easily, why he could rest when others were restless, why he could forgive without needing an explanation. Still, even Patrick, wrapped in his quiet world, felt the ache of loneliness sometimes. The lullaby was beautiful, but it was only his. He longed in some unspoken way to share it. Not in words, those slipped from him too quickly, but in being, in presence, in the silent companionship of someone who understood that meaning lives in stillness as much as in speech. And that was when he began to notice the laughter in the distance. It was not the first time he had heard it, but this time it called to him differently. A bright, bubbling laughter that seemed to cut through the water like bells ringing in a dream. Patrick could not explain why it mattered, but he felt it reaching toward him, tugging gently at the edges of his quiet world. He would hear it in the mornings sometimes, drifting faintly through the reef as he stirred beneath his rock. He would hear it in the evenings echoing through the coral when the ocean grew still. Each time it left behind an afterglow, the way light lingers after a star falls. Patrick did not know yet that this laughter belonged to SpongeBob. He only knew it felt like an answer, as though the lullaby of the tides had finally found a harmony. For now, Patrick remained beneath his stone, humming fragments of half-remembered songs, listening to the ocean breathe. But already the threads of two lives were drawing closer. His rock was no longer just a shelter. It was a stage being quietly prepared, waiting for the moment when laughter and stillness would meet and something new would begin. Patrick did not rush to meet it. He never rushed. The tides always carried him where he needed to go, and so he trusted them again, closing his eyes, letting the lullaby fill him, waiting for the gentle pull that would soon bring a friend into his life who would turn silence into song. And somewhere above him, in a pineapple house not far from the shore, the laughter rang out again, bright, unafraid, and destined to find him. Patrick had grown so used to the rhythm of the ocean's lullaby that he almost mistook the new sound for part of it. At first, it was faint, bubbling laughter carried through shifting waves, mingling with the hush of currents and the clink of shells. But the more often he heard it, the more he realized it wasn't the sea's voice at all. It was someone else's, bright and boundless, ringing as though joy itself had chosen to take form in a sound. He would lift his head from beneath the rock whenever it drifted near, blinking in curiosity, listening without moving. Sometimes it came in bursts, quick and contagious, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Other times it came in long streams of giggles that tumbled and rolled like waves against the reef. Each time, Patrick felt the same soft tug inside him, the same pull that the lullaby once gave when it wanted him to notice something important. Patrick had never been quick to act, and he didn't change now. Days passed, then weeks, and still he only listened. He wasn't afraid, but he was careful in his own way. He liked to let the ocean decide when it was time for things to happen. And yet, deep down, he felt the laughter moving closer, threading itself into the quiet fabric of his days. One morning, as the tide settled low and the reef glowed with pale light, Patrick decided to drift toward the sound.
Not all the way, not yet, just a little closer.
He spread his arms wide, letting the current take him, and allowed the water to guide him toward the laughter. It felt strange to leave the shadow of his rock for no reason other than curiosity. But then, maybe curiosity itself was a reason. Maybe the tides wanted him to go. The ocean grew brighter as he drifted. He passed through tall curtains of kelp, their long bodies swaying like dancers. He floated by a school of small fish that darted and turned in perfect unison, flashing silver and vanishing into shadow. All of it looked familiar, yet different. The same world, but filled with an expectancy, as though even the coral held its breath. And then he heard it again, closer now, so close it tickled the edges of his heart. That laughter, rolling like bubbles escaping from a secret treasure chest, unafraid of how far it carried. Patrick paused, suspended in the water, his wide eyes following the sound. For a moment, he almost thought the ocean itself was laughing back, echoing the joy until it filled every space between the reefs. When he finally saw the source, it wasn't at all what he imagined. It was just a sponge. A sponge in square pants, of all things. Not tall or commanding, not glowing or mysterious, but ordinary and extraordinary at once. He was sitting on the sand, blowing bubbles with a simple wand, each one rising like a fragile planet into the water above. And every time a bubble floated upward, he laughed, pure, unfiltered, as though each fragile sphere was a miracle. Patrick didn't move at first. He simply watched. The sponge didn't notice him, too lost in his own joy. There was something in that joy that felt familiar to Patrick, though he couldn't place why. Perhaps it was because the sponge seemed to see the world the way Patrick did, not as a place to conquer or rush through, but as something to marvel at in its smallest. Simplest moments. The sponge blew another bubble, larger this time. It shimmered with the colors of the sea, bending light until it looked like a tiny, floating rainbow. Patrick's mouth stretched slowly into a smile. Without thinking, he clapped his hands once, an awkward, heavy sound that startled a crab hiding nearby. The sponge turned. Their eyes met for the first time. Neither spoke right away. Words were not the first language they shared. It was something quieter, recognition, a kind of unspoken understanding that passed between them like the tide itself. The sponge tilted his head, curious, then grinned so wide his whole face seemed to shine. Patrick grinned back, slower, softer, but no less real. The sponge raised his bubble wand again and held it out toward Patrick as though offering a gift. Patrick hesitated. He had never blown a bubble before, but he took the wand in his wide hand, held it uncertainly, and tried. What came out was lopsided, wobbling, a bubble that clung to the wand before finally breaking free. It floated crookedly upward before popping with a tiny shimmer. Patrick laughed. Not a loud laugh, but a deep, rumbling chuckle that rose from somewhere he didn't know he had. The sponge laughed with him, and just like that the two sounds twined together, echoing off the reef until it seemed the ocean itself was humming in delight. That was how they began. Not with grand introductions or declarations, but with bubbles and laughter, with the quiet exchange of joy, too simple to explain. Patrick didn't ask the sponge's name that day, nor did the sponge ask his.
Names could wait.
What mattered was the feeling, the gentle harmony that settled into place as naturally as breathing. For the first time, Patrick felt that the lullaby of the tides was no longer his alone. Someone else had heard it too, even if they didn't know the words. They spent the rest of that morning together, chasing bubbles that rose too high, watching jellyfish drift past in slow elegance, lying side by side on the sand as though they had done so for years. Patrick didn't say much. He never needed to. The sponge filled the silence with stories, half-thoughts and little songs of his own invention, and Patrick listened with the kind of attention that made even the smallest words feel important. When the tide finally shifted and Patrick drifted back toward his rock, he felt different. The ocean's lullaby was still there, soft and steady, but now it carried a new note, a bright thread of laughter woven into its melody. Patrick realized he had been waiting for that sound without knowing it, waiting for someone who could turn the stillness of his world into something shared. As he curled beneath his rock once more, he smiled to himself. The laughter still echoed in his ears, warm and light, like stars scattered across the water. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, his dreams carried not only the voice of the tides, but the memory of a friend's joy, drifting gently into his heart. And though Patrick could not have said it then, something had begun that morning which would from the very next morning. Patrick found himself listening differently. The ocean's lullaby still filled his world, but it now carried an echo, laughter, faint but present, as though his new friend's joy had become part of the current itself. It no longer felt like he was drifting alone. Something had shifted, subtle as the turning of a tide, and Patrick woke with the quiet certainty that he would not spend the day beneath his rock. He rose slowly, brushing grains of sand from his arms, and let the current guide him back toward where the sponge lived. He didn't think of it as a choice, not really. It was simply the way things were moving, the way the ocean wanted. And sure enough, before long, he heard the familiar giggles ringing out like bright bells. The sound warmed him, like sunlight spilling through water. The sponge was waiting outside his pineapple-shaped home, holding 2 sandwiches that looked as though they had been made with the utmost care. Sea lettuce, coral bread, a few slices of kelp, uneven but heartfelt. When Patrick swam closer, the sponge's face lit up in recognition, and without a word, he offered one of the sandwiches. Patrick took it clumsily, staring at it as though it were a gift from the sea itself. The bread was already a little soggy, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the gesture, the quiet thoughtfulness in preparing two instead of one. Patrick smiled, wide and slow, and bit into the sandwich. It was simple, salty, imperfect. It was perfect. They ate side by side in the gentle current, crumbs drifting like tiny stars between them. Neither spoke at first, but it wasn't silence. It was togetherness, a kind of companionship that made the smallest actions, chewing, swallowing, brushing crumbs away, feel like part of something larger. The ocean moved around them as it always had, but for Patrick, this moment was brighter than any he had known. That day became the first of many. Sometimes they sat in the sunlit shallows, sandwiches in hand, letting their feet bury into the cool sand. Sometimes they followed schools of jellyfish, their glowing bodies pulsing like floating lanterns. Other times they lay flat on their backs, watching shadows shift across the ocean's ceiling, making shapes of the clouds they could only half see. It was never about what they did. It was about how they did it, together with laughter and patience, without needing plans or reasons. Patrick began to notice little things about his new friend. The way his laugh changed, depending on the moment, sometimes sharp and quick, sometimes long and rolling, sometimes so quiet it was almost like a sigh. The way he looked at the world with eyes wide open, as though everything deserved wonder, even the smallest pebble. Patrick didn't always understand his words, stories about working at a restaurant, about bubble tricks, about dreams that stretched taller than the ocean floor. But he understood the feeling beneath them. That was enough. One afternoon, as they lay on their backs after eating sandwiches, the sponge spoke softly. "Sometimes I think people don't take me seriously," he admitted, though his voice still carried a note of cheer.
I think I'm just silly. Patrick turned his head, blinking slowly.
He thought about that for a long time, because Patrick never rushed his answers. Finally, he said, "Silly is serious if it makes your heart lighter." The sponge's eyes widened. He looked surprised, then smiled so wide his whole face seemed to glow. Patrick smiled back, though he didn't know why his words mattered so much. He was only saying what he felt, but perhaps that was the very thing the sponge needed, that quiet reminder that being light was its own kind of strength. From then on, their friendship deepened in small ways. They began to share not only sandwiches, but also thoughts, fears, dreams. SpongeBob spoke of wanting to do great things, to work hard, to be recognized. Patrick listened, nodding slowly, then answered in his own way, usually with fewer words, but always with weight. Sometimes his words were clumsy, sometimes strange, but they carried the hush of the tides within them, and SpongeBob always listened. Patrick, in turn, shared less. He was not used to speaking of himself. But when he spoke of the lullaby of the ocean, or of dreams where stars whispered secrets, SpongeBob listened as though every word was precious. He didn't laugh, not in mockery, but in awe, as though he saw the beauty Patrick had always carried quietly inside him. It was during these moments that Patrick realized something new. His rock was no longer the only place that held stillness for him. Sitting beside SpongeBob, even in the midst of laughter or chatter, Patrick felt the same kind of peace he once thought belonged only to solitude. His friend's presence was like another kind of lullaby, one that blended with the tides until they became inseparable. One evening, as the sky above darkened and the stars flickered faintly through the water, the two of them sat in silence, their sandwiches long since eaten, their laughter fading into calm. SpongeBob leaned back with a sigh, watching the glowing jellyfish drift overhead.
Do you think, he asked softly, that we'll always be friends?
Patrick turned his head again, slow and thoughtful. He didn't answer right away. He watched the jellyfish pass, their light fading into the distance. Then he said, "We already are always." The sponge didn't fully understand what he meant, but he smiled anyway, because he felt it, felt the truth of it in the way Patrick said it, in the steady tone that carried no doubt, and in that moment, with the reef quiet around them and the stars shimmering faintly above, Patrick felt the shape of his life beginning to change. He had found what he didn't know he had been waiting for, not only the lullaby of the ocean, but a harmony to sing alongside it. That night, when he returned beneath his rock, he carried with him more than silence. He carried laughter, companionship, and the taste of sandwiches eaten in sunlight. He carried the memory of words spoken softly but felt deeply. And as he drifted into dreams, Patrick understood that his story was no longer only his. It was theirs now, woven together like seagrass in the tide, inseparable, enduring. The rock was still not empty, but for the first time, Patrick realized that it had always been waiting for another voice to fill the space beside his own. Patrick awoke the next morning with the quiet hum of the tides still lingering in his mind, but there was something new now, a faint vibration that made his arms twitch with anticipation. The sponge's laughter had become part of his mornings, threading itself through the hush of the ocean, and Patrick felt the pull to drift toward it again, though today he felt a subtle weight on his shoulders, though he could not yet name it. When he arrived, the sponge was already there, perched atop a gentle rise of sand, arranging tiny piles of shells in patterns Patrick could not quite understand. Each shell seemed to hold meaning, though he didn't know what. The sponge hummed as he worked, his small hands moving with precision and care. Patrick watched quietly for a while, then clapped once to announce his presence. The sponge turned, grinning immediately, and held up a small shell like a trophy. "Look, Patrick, see this one."
It's different. It's special, he said, voice bubbling with pride. Can you tell me why?
Patrick tilted his head slowly. He didn't answer in words because he didn't know how to explain. But he did what he always did. He watched. He noticed the way the sponge's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly with excitement, the way his laughter built slowly, then spilled over. And then instinctively Patrick reached out and nudged the shell just a little. It wobbled and then rested perfectly in line with the others, as though Patrick's touch had completed it. The sponge's eyes widened.
"You did that? You fixed it?"
he exclaimed, voice full of awe. Patrick only shrugged, slow and gentle, smiling in his quiet, unhurried way. He did not think of it as fixing. He thought of it as noticing. Noticing that the shell wanted to be part of the pattern. Noticing that the sponge wanted to share something with him. From that moment, Patrick began to realize a strange truth. He had the ability to teach, not with lessons or rules, but through presence and attention. His clumsiness, his slow, wandering thoughts, his constant drifting, they were not weaknesses. They were ways of showing others that it was okay to move at your own pace, to make mistakes, to laugh at them, to learn quietly. Days passed, each one stitched gently into the last. Sometimes Patrick would show the sponge how to balance on the edge of a current just right, so that the water carried him forward effortlessly. Sometimes he would hum small, half-forgotten tunes while they arranged shells or built little sandcastles, and the sponge would hum along, learning the rhythm not with his ears, but with his heart. Patrick's forgetfulness became a gift. He never held grudges for errors, never remembered failures too long, and thus taught the sponge to release worry in the same way. Patrick did not understand at first what his role had become. He only knew that the sponge's eyes would brighten in a way that warmed his own heart, that his laughter lingered longer when they were together, and that the small gestures, the shared sandwiches, the drifting through currents, The quiet watching of shadows were turning into lessons without words. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the waves in long, golden streams, the sponge asked something that surprised Patrick.
"Do you ever get scared?"
He said softly, looking at Patrick with unguarded honesty. Patrick thought for a long time.
"Scared of what?" he wondered.
The ocean? The tides? The shadows? He shook his head slowly.
"I used to," he admitted at last. "But
the ocean teaches you to trust, and sometimes trust is enough." The sponge tilted his head, considering this. "Trust?" he repeated. "I don't think I know how to do that." Patrick nodded gently. "It's not something you learn in a day or in a week. You practice by listening, by feeling, by letting the world be bigger than your fear. The tides will carry you if you let them." The sponge laughed softly, a sound full of relief and wonder, and Patrick realized that teaching was not about telling someone the answers. It was about showing them a way to find their own. And Patrick had been showing without realizing it all along. Evening came, soft and slow. They drifted together over the reef, the sponge pointing out shapes in the shadows of coral, Patrick following, nodding, showing small, quiet encouragement. Sometimes Patrick would touch a jellyfish gently, guiding it away from danger, and the sponge would watch and mimic, learning patience in the subtle, tender way Patrick knew instinctively. There were no textbooks, no speeches, no commands, just presence, kindness, and the gentle art of noticing. Patrick's rock no longer felt like the only place he could grow. It had once been his sanctuary, the cradle of his slow, drifting life. Now, every moment with the sponge became a new lesson in being. Patrick had become a teacher without realizing it, a quiet guide who showed that the smallest act, sharing a sandwich, listening, drifting alongside a friend, could carry more meaning than any grand plan, and yet there was more still to learn. Patrick himself was growing in ways he could not yet name. The tides whispered hints of what was coming, currents shifting just so, stars glinting faintly through the water at night. Each day, the ocean's lullaby mingled with the sponge's laughter, weaving a new song in Patrick's heart. It was a song he did not yet fully understand, but one he was beginning to recognize as the melody of life itself. Unpredictable, messy, bright, and endlessly patient. As night fell and the water grew darker, Patrick returned to his rock, curling into the familiar comfort of his quiet home. But the lesson of the day lingered, humming softly through his body. Teaching was not about instruction. It was about presence. It was about trust, laughter, and gentle guidance. And he had found someone who could teach him that too. For the first time, Patrick understood that his life was no longer only about drifting through tides and listening to lullabies. It was about sharing them, carrying them alongside another heart, and discovering that even the quietest, slowest creatures could hold a gentle kind of power, a power not of might or speed, but of attention, patience, and care. And somewhere in the distance, as he drifted off to sleep beneath his rock, he could hear the faint echo of laughter from his friend, mingling with the lullaby of the tides, a promise of more lessons, more wonder, and more quiet adventures waiting in the days ahead. Next evening, as the sun dipped low and the water shimmered with streaks of amber and silver, Patrick floated near the surface, letting the tides cradle him like a soft, endless hammock. The sponge had gone home for the night, leaving a lingering trail of laughter and warmth behind, and Patrick felt a strange kind of quiet settle around him. The lullaby of the ocean hummed gently, but tonight it seemed fuller, more resonant, as though it had something urgent, yet soft to tell him. He tilted his head upward, letting the fading light catch the patterns of ripples on the waves above, and for the first time he truly noticed the stars. They were not like the stars he had seen in dreams, faint and distant shapes that shimmered in half-forgotten lullabies. These stars were real, scattered like tiny lanterns above the ocean, reflecting their light on the water in trails that seemed to stretch infinitely. Patrick felt a thrill that was gentle and calm, a quiet awe that did not rush or demand, but filled every part of him with wonder. He could not name why they mattered so much, but he knew the ocean had brought him here to see them. The stars seemed alive in ways Patrick had not anticipated. Each shimmer looked as though it were listening, as though it had seen all the laughter and small kindness he had carried beneath his rock, all the drifting hours of solitude, all the tiny, quiet lessons he had passed on to the sponge without knowing it. He felt that the stars were witnesses scattered and patient, bearing gentle testimony to his life. And in that realization, Patrick felt an unfamiliar sense of connection, as though the ocean, the stars, and he were part of a single breath. Patrick closed his eyes briefly and let the currents shift around him. He thought of the sponge, of the laughter that had become a second lullaby, of the way his own presence now guided someone else without him trying. And in the space between the hush of the ocean and the shimmer of the stars, he realized something profound. The world was much larger than any single creature, yet somehow even the smallest beings mattered. His existence, his drifting, his simple acts of attention, they were threads in a vast tapestry that included the tides, the stars, the laughter of friends, and the quiet hum of being. A gentle current nudged him forward, and Patrick allowed himself to float with it. The motion was slow and deliberate, like the deliberate unfolding of a secret. As he drifted, he noticed shapes in the water, shadows of creatures moving in the dimming light, jellyfish pulsing softly like tiny lanterns, fish darting like liquid silver. Everything seemed deliberate, as though the ocean had choreographed it to teach him the patience and rhythm of life.
He felt a pull, a quiet insistence to keep moving.
To keep noticing, to keep listening. Patrick thought back to the mornings beneath his rock, when he had learned the hush of the tides, the strange comfort of emptiness, filled only with silence. Those days now seemed like the foundation for everything he was beginning to understand, that stillness was not absence, that observing was a kind of participation, that drifting could be a form of guidance. And now floating here under the early stars, he felt the first stirrings of what it meant to be more than a simple observer, to be a quiet participant in the unfolding story of the ocean,
of the world, and of friendship. Time passed without Patrick noticing.
Minutes slipped into hours, or perhaps they were only seconds. The ocean had no concern for clocks. The stars moved slowly across the water's surface, their reflections stretching and bending, painting the reef with light that was both real and imagined. Patrick's thoughts wandered to the sponge, and he realized how much their companionship had changed him. The sponge had brought laughter, yes, but also presence, curiosity, and the gentle insistence that life could be shared in simple moments. Patrick understood that the lullaby of the tides had expanded. It now carried echoes of another's heart, mingling seamlessly with his own. He drifted closer to the surface, where the water glimmered with the final light of the setting sun. He felt a quiet urge to reach higher, not physically, but spiritually, emotionally. The stars above seemed to respond, their flickers growing sharper, more insistent, guiding him to a clarity he could barely put into words. He realized slowly that the infinite sky and the endless ocean were not separate. They were one, connected by light, by water, by the breath of living things, and by the unseen currents that moved between hearts. Patrick let out a slow, deep sigh, a sound that mingled with the hush of the ocean and the quiet twinkle of the stars. He felt a strange peace, a knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be, not in haste, not in fear, not in striving, Simply here, drifting, noticing, carrying the quiet power of his small but significant existence. He thought of the sponge again, imagining him sleeping under the warm glow of the pineapple house, dreaming his own dreams, drifting gently in his own way, unaware that their lives had already intertwined in ways neither could yet measure. As the night deepened, Patrick floated beneath the stars, letting their light pour over him like a gentle rain. He realized that the ocean's lullaby and the laughter of his friend had become a single melody, one that would guide him in all the days to come. He felt the quiet strength of knowing that even small beings, even those who drift slowly and speak softly, could leave ripples that stretched farther than they imagined. He could not name what the future held, could not foresee every turn of tide or shadow in the reef, but he trusted it. He trusted the rhythm of the currents, the music of the stars, and the bonds that had begun to form with another heart. Patrick finally returned to his rock, curling beneath it with the soft press of sand against his skin. He carried the warmth of the sponge's laughter, the shimmer of the stars, and the hush of the ocean inside him. His world had expanded not through force or ambition, but through presence, attention, and trust. He felt, for the first time, that he was not only a starfish under a rock, but a quiet witness to something larger, something infinite, luminous and patient. As he drifted towards sleep, Patrick whispered to himself in a voice barely louder than the lullaby of the tides, "The world is wide, and yet it is small enough to hold joy, laughter, and love."
I will notice it. I will carry it. And with that,
He let the ocean cradle him, the stars watch over him, and the memory of his friend's laughter settle into his heart. The following morning, the ocean felt softer than usual, as though it had taken a deep breath and let it out slowly, preparing Patrick for the day ahead. The sun had just begun to filter through the water in long golden shafts, painting the reef in gentle light. Patrick rose from beneath his rock, stretching in the current that carried him like a patient, invisible hand. His thoughts drifted to the sponge, and he felt the familiar tug of anticipation, a gentle pull that was neither urgency nor fear.
only expectation. He found SpongeBob already waiting near the sandbank.
Kneeling beside a small tide pool filled with colourful stones, the sponge hummed a little tune as he arranged the stones in patterns that looked like constellations. Patrick paused, watching silently as his friend's hands moved with care. Each placement seemed deliberate yet effortless, as though SpongeBob was not merely arranging stones, but telling a story the way the tides told theirs. Patrick did not speak at first. He simply hovered near, letting the water move him closer, feeling the rhythm of the day settle into him. The sponge looked up and smiled when he noticed Patrick, and that simple smile carried a warmth so deep it seemed to ripple through the water. Patrick smiled back, slow and soft, and without a word, they continued their quiet work. Time passed unnoticed, measured only by the subtle shifts of light across the sand and the gentle movements of fish weaving through the tide. Patrick began to realize that these shared moments, these small acts of presence, were teaching him something new. Friendship, he thought, was not only about laughter or shared adventures. It was about understanding, noticing the unspoken, and feeling the weight of another heart without needing to lift it. SpongeBob placed a final stone, stepped back, and let out a satisfied sigh. "Do you see it, Patrick?"
"It's like the stars, but down here," he said, voice soft and full of wonder.
Patrick looked at the arrangement and felt the same quiet awe he had felt when he first noticed the stars above the ocean. He did not know if he could explain why it moved him, but he understood it with the part of himself that listened without needing words. Patrick reached out slowly, nudging a small stone just slightly to balance it with the others. SpongeBob's eyes widened, and he laughed quietly, the sound mingling with the lullaby of the ocean.
You feel it too, don't you?
The sponge asked. Patrick only nodded, slow and deliberate. Words were unnecessary. The act, the connection, was enough. That day, as the current carried them through gentle stretches of the reef, Patrick began to see the ways he and SpongeBob were teaching each other without realizing it. The sponge's curiosity pushed Patrick to notice things he might otherwise have ignored. A tiny crab hiding beneath a coral shelf, a pulse of light reflecting from a passing fish, the subtle shift in the current that hinted at deeper water beyond. Patrick's calm, unhurried way of being taught SpongeBob patience, the understanding that not every movement needed a purpose, not every thought demanded expression. They paused for a moment in a sunlit clearing, letting the water cradle them. Patrick watched the sponge's hands drift lazily through the current, stirring small clouds of sand that glowed in the golden light. Patrick felt the soft tug of inspiration in his chest, a warmth that was almost a song. He realized that this, being here, quietly with another, was a form of guidance. It did not rely on words or lessons or expectations. It relied on trust, on the gentle sharing of presence, on the unspoken reassurance that they were both part of the same tide, moving together.
Patrick, SpongeBob said after a pause, voice hushed, sometimes I feel like I have to do everything perfectly.
Like I need to be fast or smart or ready for anything. But when I'm with you, I don't feel that way.
I just float. Patrick blinked slowly, the corners of his mouth curling into a soft smile. That's what the tide teaches, he said.
You don't have to rush. You don't have to be everything at once.
You just have to be here, and that's enough. The sponge's eyes shone with something between relief and wonder.
Patrick did not elaborate, because he did not need to. The moment itself carried the lesson. And in that quiet, shared understanding, Patrick felt the full weight of friendship for the first time, not loud or demanding, but steady, enduring, and infinitely patient. They drifted along the reef for hours, letting currents guide them, pausing to watch schools of fish dart in silver flashes, laughing quietly at the way the water sometimes caught a stray bubble and rolled it toward them. They shared sandwiches again, half-eaten and clumsy, but rich with comfort, and Patrick marveled at how the simplest acts could carry the deepest joy. He realized that every shared glance, every small gesture, every soft laugh was a thread weaving them closer together, a bond that needed no explanation, only attention. As the sun dipped lower and the water darkened into shades of deep blue, Patrick and the sponge found themselves resting in a quiet corner of the reef, surrounded by shadows and faint glimmers of light. Patrick floated beside his friend, letting the current cradle them both. The sponge's small, rhythmic breathing was like another note in the lullaby that Patrick had carried his whole life. And for the first time, Patrick felt that the quiet power of presence, the ability to listen, to notice, to simply exist alongside another, was as important as any act of bravery.
Any adventure, any burst of laughter. Patrick closed his eyes,
letting the tide hum through him, blending with the sponge's soft presence. He thought of the stars above, of the infinite stretches of water and light, and of the way their hearts now seemed to beat in quiet unison. Friendship, he realized, was not a rush to achievement or an insistence on understanding. It was trust. It was laughter. It was the willingness to float together through currents that neither could fully see. And in that stillness, Patrick knew that the days to come would be filled with gentle discoveries, lessons learned in laughter, in bubbles, in sandwiches shared and moments of silence held. He understood that he and SpongeBob were no longer just drifting creatures sharing the same reef. They were companions, co-authors of a quiet story written not in words, but in attention, care, and the soft, enduring music of life itself. As Patrick finally drifted beneath his rock that night, the sponge's laughter and the lullaby of the tides intertwined in his mind, settling into a melody that would guide him in the nights and days ahead. He let himself exhale fully, trusting the currents, the stars, and the quiet wisdom of friendship to carry him forward. And for the first time, he felt the infinite patience of the world, the gentle guidance of another heart, and the quiet power of simply being present. Patrick woke to a morning that felt different, though he could not say exactly why. The water around his rock glimmered with a brightness that seemed sharper, yet softer at the same time, as if the ocean itself had taken a deep, deliberate breath. He stretched slowly, letting the currents brush gently against him, and thought of SpongeBob, of laughter echoing in the quiet spaces of the reef, of shells balanced just so in tiny tide pools. Today, it felt as though the reef held more than sand and coral. It held possibilities, threads of things unseen, waiting for him to notice. He drifted toward the familiar stretch of sand where SpongeBob would almost certainly be waiting. The sponge was already there, arranging small collections of shells and stones in patterns that seemed at once random and deliberate. Patrick watched for a moment, floating gently with the tide, noticing the way sunlight streaked through the water, creating flickering patterns that danced across the sponge's square form. Patrick felt the quiet pull of anticipation, not urgent, not anxious, but the steady tug of something greater, just out of reach. SpongeBob looked up and smiled immediately, eyes bright and unguarded. "Morning, Patrick,"
Look at these,
he said, pointing to a set of stones that shimmered faintly in the sun. They almost looked like tiny suns caught in the sand. Patrick tilted his head, studying the arrangement. He did not yet understand why these patterns mattered, but he felt the pull of intention behind them. The ocean had taught him patience, had shown him that noticing without rushing could reveal truths far deeper than words. And in this simple act of observing the stones, Patrick realized he was beginning to see the sponge not merely as a friend, but as a mirror of the lessons he himself had begun to carry. "Beautiful," Patrick said softly, his voice rumbling like distant water. He nudged a small shell closer to align with the others. SpongeBob's eyes widened.
you see the way they fit?
Patrick said without thinking.
Sometimes things just
"Want to be together. They don't need force. They just need to be noticed." SpongeBob's smile deepened, and he nodded, letting the words sink in. Patrick watched as the sponge's eyes roamed across the reef, taking in every ripple of sand, every glimmering fish, every floating bubble. Patrick realized that this act of seeing, really seeing, was part of what the tides had been teaching him all along. It was not just about observing, but about recognizing the currents of intention in the world, the invisible lines that connect life in quiet, unhurried ways. They spent the morning moving through the reef together, letting the currents carry them from one tide pool to another. Patrick showed SpongeBob how to balance on gentle currents just right, how to drift without effort, and how to notice the subtle changes in light and movement that signaled something important. The sponge learned quickly, his wide eyes drinking in every detail, though he did not yet understand the depth of the lessons he was absorbing. Patrick, in turn, felt a growing awareness of how much his own life was shaped by these same subtleties: the quiet pull of the tide, the shimmer of sunlight on sand, the laughter of a friend shared across small spaces. As they drifted, Patrick began to notice hints of something beyond the reef. Currents that moved differently, shadows that hinted at deeper waters, shapes of fish he had never seen. The ocean seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of what he had known, whispering of a larger world, a tapestry of tides and stars and unseen paths. He did not understand it fully, but the tug in his chest told him that he would one day need to move beyond these familiar sands, that the reef was only the beginning. "Patrick," SpongeBob said softly, floating beside him. Do you ever wonder what's beyond all this? The reef, the shells, the tides.
What else is out there?
Patrick paused, letting the question settle. The water around them felt fuller, heavier with possibility. Sometimes, he admitted, I feel the currents pulling toward places I don't know yet. But the ocean is patient. It will guide us when the time is right. SpongeBob looked at him with wide eyes, trust unspoken but complete. Patrick realized that part of friendship was this: sharing not only what you know, but also the quiet acceptance of what you do not. Together they could navigate currents unseen, learn lessons not yet revealed, and trust that the tides themselves would carry them where they were meant to go. The day passed slowly, filled with drifting and laughter, small discoveries and quiet observations. Patrick showed SpongeBob how to watch a group of tiny shrimp scuttling across a coral ridge, how to notice the subtle change in the way a bubble moved with the current, how to let the water itself determine the pace of movement. The sponge absorbed everything with his usual wonder, his eyes bright, his laugh soft and constant. Patrick realized that their shared presence had become a kind of language, unspoken but deeply felt, guiding both of them through the endless small lessons of life beneath the sea. As evening approached, the water darkened into deep blue, and the stars above began to glimmer faintly through the surface. Patrick and SpongeBob rested near the sandbank, letting the currents cradle them gently. Patrick felt the first real awareness of the world beyond what he had known. The reef was no longer the boundary of his life. He could sense the threads of something larger weaving through the ocean, subtle and patient, waiting for him to notice. He turned to SpongeBob, whose small eyes reflected the fading light, and said softly, "The world is bigger than we think.
Not just the reef, not just the tides we know.
There are currents we cannot see yet, places we cannot imagine. But if we notice, if we drift patiently, we can find them." SpongeBob nodded, a mixture of awe and trust in his expression.
"Then we'll drift together," he whispered.
"Wherever the ocean takes us." Patrick felt a warmth spread through him, the quiet exhale of understanding. Yes, he thought, together they would follow the currents, notice the unseen, and let the tides guide them. The world beyond the reef would come in its own time, and they would be ready, not with haste, not with fear, but with patience, laughter, and the soft power of friendship. That night, Patrick returned beneath his rock with a heart lighter, fuller, and attuned to the infinite possibilities around him. The reef had taught him to notice, to drift, and to care. The sponge had taught him to share, to laugh, and to trust. And the tides, with their infinite patience and whispering currents, were beginning to reveal that even small, slow beings could move through the world with quiet purpose, carrying the lessons of the ocean wherever they drifted. Patrick curled into his usual space beneath the rock, closing his eyes and listening to the lullaby of the tides, now intertwined with the echo of the sponge's laughter and the vast, unspoken promise of the ocean beyond. The world was larger than he had ever imagined, yet small enough to hold wonder, friendship, and quiet joy, and he trusted that the currents would guide them both, as they had always done. Morning carried a quiet sense of purpose that Patrick had not felt before. The sun's light filtered through the water in long, wavering beams, painting everything it touched with soft gold, and the ocean seemed to hum a gentle, expectant tune. Patrick rose from beneath his rock with a sense of unspoken anticipation, his limbs stretching into the current as though it had been waiting for him. Today felt different. The reef, familiar and comforting though it was, could no longer contain the fullness of what he sensed in the tides. He drifted toward SpongeBob, who was already waiting near a familiar patch of sand, his eyes bright and eager. "Morning, Patrick. Ready for an adventure?" the sponge asked, his voice bubbling with excitement that softened in the warm water. Patrick blinked slowly, his smile wide but unhurried. "Yes," he said simply. And that single word carried the weight of understanding he had only recently begun to grasp. Their plan was simple: to follow the currents beyond the reef, to see what lay in the deeper waters that shimmered just beyond the sandbanks and coral ridges. There was no urgency, no pressure, only the quiet pull of curiosity and trust. The reef had taught them safety, laughter, and the delicate art of noticing. Now it was time to let the tides guide them further. As they drifted together, Patrick began to notice how the water itself seemed to shift as they approached the boundary of the familiar. The currents deepened, carrying a stronger undertone, yet still patient, as though urging them forward while reminding them to move gently. Schools of fish swirled around them, creating fleeting shadows on the sand below, and tiny jellyfish pulsed like living lanterns in their path. Patrick felt the pull of the unseen, an invisible thread guiding him toward something larger, something both strange and comforting. SpongeBob stayed close, his hands trailing through the water, feeling the subtle shifts of the currents, trusting Patrick to lead with instinct rather than force. "Patrick," he said softly after a pause, "do you think we'll find
Something special out here?"
Patrick blinked slowly, letting the words settle like fine sand. "Special," he murmured, "isn't always what you expect. Sometimes it's just a quiet understanding, a pattern, a feeling. The ocean shows you in its own way." As they moved further, the water darkened slightly, not menacingly, but with the weight of mystery. Shadows of distant rocks loomed, and the currents tugged with subtle insistence. Patrick noticed the way SpongeBob hesitated at the edge of a deeper trench, his square form trembling just slightly in the current. Patrick reached out a gentle hand, brushing against his friend's arm.
"It's okay," he said softly. "Just notice."
"Let the water guide you. We're together." SpongeBob nodded, taking a deep breath. The fear was still there, faint and pulsing, but the presence of Patrick, steady, calm, attentive, turned it into curiosity. They drifted closer, letting the current carry them into the trench, where shadows deepened and light fractured into streams of silver and green. Patrick felt the familiar stirrings of wonder and humility. The deeper waters were not threatening. They were alive, patient, and full of quiet lessons waiting to be understood. They paused near a cluster of rocks covered in moss and small coral, observing creatures they had never noticed before: tiny crabs scuttling along ridges, luminescent plankton drifting lazily in the current, a lone seahorse hovering with delicate grace. Patrick let SpongeBob notice first, guiding his gaze with soft nudges and slow gestures. Each small discovery became a shared secret, a quiet celebration of attention and presence. Hours passed in gentle exploration,
Measured not by time, but by the flow of water.
the rise and fall of light, the rhythm of breath, and the occasional shared laugh. SpongeBob asked questions mostly about the creatures they saw, and Patrick answered with simple observations, careful not to force meanings. Each answer was like a ripple in the water, subtle yet resonant, teaching the sponge that sometimes understanding came not from explanation, but from shared observation and quiet trust. As the day deepened, Patrick noticed currents that moved differently, pulling gently toward areas beyond the trench. He understood, without needing words, that these currents were invitations, paths the ocean itself offered. He turned to SpongeBob, whose eyes were wide with awe and trust. "Do you feel that?" Patrick asked softly. "The tide is showing us something.
Not telling, just showing."
We have to notice and then follow." SpongeBob nodded, his trust absolute.
"I'll follow," he whispered.
"Wherever the ocean leads." They drifted together, following the unseen paths, learning to read the subtle changes in the water, the way it shifted around a rocky outcrop, the faint pull beneath a patch of plankton, the small swirl of bubbles that hinted at a hidden current. Patrick marveled at how much he had learned, simply by noticing, by trusting the rhythm of the ocean. and by sharing it with someone who understood that the greatest lessons often came without words. At the far edge of the trench, they discovered a clearing of soft sand and waving kelp, bathed in a gentle cascade of filtered sunlight from above. It was a quiet place, untouched, luminous with hidden life. Patrick hovered, letting the water move him slowly, watching SpongeBob's awe-filled expression.
"It's beautiful," the sponge whispered, voice full of reverence. Patrick nodded slowly.
The ocean always has more to show. You just have to notice and sometimes trust that it's leading you to what you need. They rested there, letting the currents cradle them, watching tiny fish and shifting shadows dance among the kelp. Patrick realized that exploration was not about finding treasures or facing danger. It was about noticing, trusting, and learning through gentle presence, lessons the tides themselves whispered in currents, shadows, and the flicker of light. SpongeBob's laughter, small and soft, echoed like a lullaby over the silent sand, and Patrick felt the subtle weight of the world unfold around them, immense yet gentle, mysterious yet patient. As the sun began to lower toward the surface, the two friends turned slowly back toward the familiar reef, drifting quietly together. The day's exploration had shown them more than new waters. It had revealed patience, trust, the subtle power of noticing, and the quiet courage required to follow unseen currents. Patrick realized that every adventure, no matter how small or slow, carried lessons deeper than the ocean itself. Returning beneath his rock that night, Patrick felt a gentle satisfaction settle into his heart. The reef had expanded not merely in space but in meaning. The tides had shown them paths unseen, and their friendship had carried them safely through shadows and light alike. He drifted into sleep with the quiet hum of currents, SpongeBob's laughter, and the promise of further exploration weaving a lullaby of trust, wonder, and infinite patience. The day began with the soft hum of the tides, gentle currents brushing against Patrick as he stretched slowly beneath his rock. There was an unusual stillness in the water, a quiet pause that seemed to hold its breath, and Patrick felt a faint pull of unease mixed with anticipation. He rose, letting the currents carry him gently toward the sandbank where SpongeBob would be waiting. The sponge was already there, floating lightly above the reef, his eyes wide with excitement and curiosity. "Good morning, Patrick."
"Are you ready to see what's beyond today?"
Patrick smiled, slow and calm. "Yes," he said, letting the single word float like a leaf on the current. Together, they began to drift toward the open waters beyond the familiar reef, the currents guiding them past familiar coral ridges and shimmering sand patches. The ocean felt different here, full of whispers, of subtle shifts that Patrick could feel more than see. He realized that the tides were teaching him again, now with a deeper, almost imperceptible lesson. Even gentle waters could carry challenges. As they moved further, the light dimmed slightly, filtered through deeper water. Shadows stretched in ways that Patrick had not noticed before, and the currents shifted unpredictably, brushing against them in faint, hesitant pulses. SpongeBob lingered close, glancing at Patrick with a hint of unease. "Do you feel that?"
he asked softly.
"It's different." Patrick nodded slowly. "Yes, it's the ocean reminding us that not every path is easy. Sometimes noticing isn't enough. Sometimes we have to trust, even when we can't see what's ahead." His words were calm, deliberate, carrying a quiet reassurance. SpongeBob exhaled, nodding, and let the current carry him alongside Patrick, trusting the slow rhythm of the starfish's presence. They drifted over a field of jagged rocks, barely visible beneath the filtered light. Patrick noticed small swirling eddies forming near the shadows, subtle traps in the water that could catch an unwary swimmer. He guided SpongeBob gently with a soft nudge, showing him how to feel the current, how to anticipate the shifts, how to trust the pull of the ocean rather than resist it. The sponge followed with wide-eyed attention, his movements careful yet full of curiosity, learning from Patrick's quiet guidance. A sudden shift in the current caused a cloud of sand to swirl into their path, obscuring the rocks below. SpongeBob blinked rapidly, feeling disoriented.
Patrick, I can't see.
Which way do we go? Patrick floated close, placing a gentle arm on his friend's shoulder. Don't fight it, he murmured. Let the water show you. Feel it. Notice the pull and follow it gently.
I'll be here. SpongeBob inhaled slowly and let himself drift, eyes closed, trusting Patrick and the currents alike.
Patrick guided him subtly, nudging him with quiet insistence, not rushing, not forcing, only providing presence. Step by step, they moved through the swirling sand, past jagged rocks and into clearer water. The current softened and the shadows receded, leaving them in a calm, sunlit patch of deeper reef. SpongeBob opened his eyes, relief washing over his expression. "We made it," he whispered, awe and gratitude mingling in his voice. Patrick smiled slowly. "We did, because we trusted. Not in seeing, but in noticing and following together." The subtle challenge of the shifting currents had become a lesson in patience, trust, and quiet courage. Patrick realized that the ocean, in its infinite patience, often placed obstacles not to harm, but to teach, to guide those who were willing to observe and respond gently. SpongeBob, in turn, had learned that fear did not have to paralyze. It could be felt, acknowledged, and released through trust and calm presence. They continued drifting, now more aware of the unseen rhythms of the water, letting currents guide them rather than fighting them. Patrick showed SpongeBob how to anticipate subtle eddies, how to ride gentle pulses that carried them farther than they could swim, how to notice the small shifts that hinted at deeper waters. Every movement, every observation became a lesson, an unspoken dialogue between friend and friend, ocean and observer. Hours passed in slow, careful exploration. The reef expanded before them, revealing hidden alcoves, soft sandy patches, and tiny creatures moving through the water with graceful precision. Patrick noticed the interplay of light and shadow, showing SpongeBob how to let the patterns of the ocean dictate their path. The sponge's laughter came slowly at first, cautious in the face of the challenge they had just navigated, then richer as confidence and understanding grew. Patrick felt a quiet joy in this shared discovery, in the subtle magic of noticing together. As evening approached, the currents softened, and the water grew warmer with the fading sunlight. Patrick and SpongeBob found a quiet cove, sheltered by rock formations, and rested together. The small challenge of the morning had deepened their connection, weaving trust and patience into a tapestry neither could yet name, but both could feel. Patrick understood more clearly than ever that the quiet power of guidance lay not in words or force, but in presence, calm,
and steady attention. SpongeBob glanced at Patrick with something between wonder and reverence. "I think—"
"I understand now," he said softly. "The ocean isn't just water.
It's lessons.
And being here with you, I can learn them without fear." Patrick nodded slowly, a warm rumble of acknowledgement vibrating through him. Yes, and the lessons never truly end. The tides, the currents, the unseen paths, they are always here, always teaching if we are willing to notice.
And we will notice.
Together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Patrick led SpongeBob back toward the familiar reef, their movements slow, measured, and full of quiet understanding. The day had revealed not just the hidden edges of the ocean, but the depth of their friendship and the subtle ways courage and trust could guide them through unknown currents. Returning beneath his rock that night, Patrick let himself drift into the quiet lullaby of the tides, feeling the lingering warmth of shared presence, laughter, and discovery. He carried with him the knowledge that the ocean, vast and patient, was always ready to teach those who noticed, who trusted, and who moved gently through its rhythms. And he carried SpongeBob's trust with him too, a soft anchor of companionship that made the currents feel less vast, less unknown, and infinitely full of quiet wonder. Patrick curled beneath his rock, letting the gentle pull of the tides cradle him. He closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the ocean, SpongeBob's laughter echoing faintly in his mind, and felt the subtle, steady thrill of a world full of endless lessons, endless discoveries and endless quiet joy. And somewhere in the currents, he knew the tides were already preparing the next gentle challenge, the next lesson, the next opportunity for trust, patience, and shared wonder. The morning sun filtered through the waves with a gentle warmth that seemed to awaken every grain of sand and speck of plankton in the reef. Patrick rose slowly from beneath his rock, feeling the familiar tug of the tide beneath him. Today, the ocean carried a quiet promise, a subtle invitation that whispered of places yet unseen and secrets waiting to be noticed. He stretched into the current, letting it cradle him, and thought of SpongeBob, already waiting near a tangle of waving kelp, eyes wide with expectation. "Morning, Patrick," SpongeBob called softly, his voice blending with the hum of the currents. "Are you ready to explore today?" Patrick blinked slowly and smiled, letting the warmth of trust fill him.
"Yes," he said, the word drifting lightly like a bubble rising to the surface.
Together, they began to move toward the deeper waters beyond the familiar stretches of the reef, where shadows played with light and currents hinted at hidden paths. As they drifted, Patrick noticed a shift in the water, a subtle coolness, a faint ripple that suggested a hidden alcove nearby. He nudged SpongeBob gently, guiding him toward a narrow opening in a coral wall, partially concealed by waving strands of kelp.
"There," Patrick said softly.
"Something waits for us here, but we must notice carefully." SpongeBob peered into the shadowed gap, his eyes reflecting curiosity and awe.
"It looks mysterious," he whispered.
Patrick nodded, feeling the pulse of anticipation in the water. "The ocean often hides treasures in quiet places," he said. "Not all treasures are shiny or loud. Some are soft, subtle, and they teach us if we pay attention." They slipped through the kelp-lined passage, currents moving them gently like a hand guiding them forward. On the other side, they found themselves in a hidden grove of the reef, a quiet sanctuary where sunlight filtered in soft beams, illuminating clusters of coral in strange, intricate patterns. Tiny creatures moved delicately among the branches, translucent fish that shimmered with internal light, crabs with shells that seemed painted by the sea itself, and delicate anemones that swayed as if breathing in rhythm with the currents. Patrick floated slowly,
eyes wide, absorbing the quiet magic around him.
SpongeBob mirrored his movements, letting the wonder settle in him like sand in still water. "It's beautiful," SpongeBob whispered, voice trembling slightly with awe. Patrick nodded, a gentle rumble vibrating through him.
"Yes, it is."
"And it's all here for noticing, not taking. The ocean offers its lessons softly, not forcefully." They drifted among the coral branches, moving with care so as not to disturb the delicate balance of life. Patrick pointed out subtle patterns, how a school of tiny fish swirled around a hidden crevice, how the light caught the edges of the coral to create fleeting rainbows, how the smallest ripple could shift shadows in ways that revealed new paths. SpongeBob followed each observation closely, learning not only to see but to feel the rhythm of this hidden world. At the center of the grove, they discovered a small, smooth patch of sand, encircled by coral arches. Tiny bubbles rose from fissures beneath the sand, catching the sunlight in soft sparkles. Patrick hovered above the patch, sensing its quiet significance. "This is a place the reef has kept for itself," he said softly.
"It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention.
"But it holds the heart of what the ocean is teaching us. Patience, observation, and respect. SpongeBob sank slowly to rest on the sand, eyes bright as he took in the hidden sanctuary.
"It feels alive," he whispered.
Patrick nodded, moving to settle beside him. The ocean isn't alive in the way we think. It's alive in subtle ways, currents, patterns, connections. It teaches us that noticing gently is a kind of magic. They remained in silence for a long while, drifting together in the currents, letting the grove wrap around them like a soft blanket. Patrick noticed that even the smallest movements, SpongeBob's hand brushing against a coral branch, a tiny fish darting past, sent ripples through their awareness. Each ripple was a lesson, a reminder that life, like the ocean, was composed of countless small interactions, each carrying meaning if one only noticed. SpongeBob finally spoke, voice soft and reflective.
"I think I understand now. Noticing isn't just seeing.
It's feeling, understanding, and trusting that what we notice matters, even if we can't explain it." Patrick smiled, slow and approving. "Exactly. The ocean shows us that lessons come quietly, but they are powerful if we let them settle in us." They spent hours exploring the grove, discovering hidden crevices, shimmering sand patches, and strange, delicate creatures that seemed to move in harmony with some silent rhythm. Patrick showed SpongeBob how to let the current guide him without rushing, how to let his attention flow to what mattered in each moment, and how to feel the subtle balance between curiosity and respect. The sponge absorbed it all, his wonder deepening with every passing minute. As the light began to fade, Patrick guided SpongeBob back toward the opening of the grove. The shadows lengthened, currents softened, and the hidden alcove that had once seemed mysterious now felt familiar, almost protective. "The ocean will always have more to show," Patrick said softly. "But some places are meant to be discovered slowly with care."
"And this grove? It's one of those places." SpongeBob nodded, a quiet reverence in his expression. "I'll remember it," he whispered.
"And I'll notice it again, slowly, carefully, every time I come here." Patrick felt a warm pulse of satisfaction. The lessons of trust, patience, and the magic of noticing were settling in deeper than ever before. They drifted back toward the familiar reef as the sun dipped lower, the hidden grove lingering in their minds like a soft, luminous memory. Patrick realized that the ocean's patience and subtle magic were teaching them not only about the world around them, but about themselves, about friendship, and about the quiet courage required to notice, trust, and explore. That night, beneath his rock, Patrick let himself settle into the lullaby of the currents, SpongeBob's soft laughter and wide-eyed wonder echoing faintly in his mind. The hidden grove had revealed that the reef was larger than its physical boundaries. It was a sanctuary of lessons, a place where subtle magic thrived and where patience and observation were the keys to understanding. Patrick drifted into sleep, carrying the quiet satisfaction of discovery, the deepening bond with his friend, and the infinite patience of the ocean itself. The morning came with a subtle hush, as if the ocean itself had drawn a slow, deep breath. Patrick rose from beneath his rock, letting the currents cradle him as he stretched, muscles pliant and calm, and thought of the grove they had discovered the day before. The memory of the hidden sanctuary lingered, glowing softly like a distant star, and Patrick felt the quiet tug of curiosity once again. Today the tides seemed to hum with a faint insistence, a gentle beckoning toward places still unseen, lessons still unlearned. SpongeBob was already waiting near the edge of the familiar reef, his square frame drifting lightly in the current, eyes bright and expectant. "Good morning, Patrick. Are we going further today?"
he asked, voice tinged with wonder.
Patrick nodded slowly, the familiar rumble in his chest vibrating softly. "Yes," he said, letting the word settle like a pebble into the water. "The ocean has more to show us, and we need to notice carefully. The deeper we go, the quieter the lessons become, but the meaning grows stronger. They set off together, drifting past the reefs and sandbanks through currents that carried them with gentle insistence. The water grew slightly cooler, denser, as though welcoming them into a quieter, older part of the ocean. Patrick led the way, feeling the pull of unseen paths, while SpongeBob followed closely, trusting the starfish's steady guidance. The reef expanded around them, coral structures twisting in unfamiliar shapes, casting shadows that danced like slow-moving thoughts in the light. Patrick noticed subtle changes in the water, slight eddies that hinted at hidden crevices, the faint shimmer of bioluminescent plankton that rose from deeper trenches, and the soft, almost imperceptible hum of currents brushing past rock formations. "The ocean speaks in whispers here," Patrick murmured, floating closer to SpongeBob. "Not every current is a lesson, but some are. We have to feel them, follow them gently, and notice the small signs." SpongeBob nodded, his movements slow, deliberate, learning to let the rhythm of the water guide him rather than relying solely on sight. He reached out toward a faint shimmer in the distance, a cluster of tiny, glowing organisms suspended in the current.
"Patrick, look," he whispered.
"It's like the water itself is breathing." Patrick smiled softly, watching the sponge's awe. Yes, the ocean breathes in its own way, not always loud, not always visible. But if you notice, you feel its pulse, and sometimes that pulse leads you somewhere new. As they drifted further, the shadows grew longer, the water deepening into shades of green and blue that seemed to hold quiet secrets. Patrick sensed a subtle change in the current, a gentle tug that urged them toward a narrow canyon carved from stone and coral. The edges were smooth, worn by countless tides, and the passage seemed to hum with life unseen. "This way," Patrick murmured. "The ocean is inviting us into a quiet place. We must move slowly and notice everything." SpongeBob floated alongside him, eyes wide, heart attuned to Patrick's steady presence. He felt the shift in the water, the delicate pull of the currents, and realized that the reef was not just a collection of coral and sand. It was a living, breathing network of lessons, patterns, and subtle guidance. Patrick guided him through the canyon, pointing out tiny creatures that darted between rocks, the way sunlight fractured and scattered into the water, and the gentle pulse of the currents that seemed to carry hidden songs. At the canyon's center, they found a deep pool, sheltered by high coral walls and softly illuminated by shafts of sunlight filtering from above. Tiny fish hovered in delicate formations, translucent and shimmering, while the water itself seemed to hum with a quiet energy. Patrick paused, letting the stillness settle around them.
"This place..."
"It's older than the reef we know," he murmured. "It carries memory, patience, and a quiet kind of wisdom. The ocean is showing us something important, but only if we notice with care." SpongeBob floated close, eyes tracing the subtle movements of life around them.
"It feels, alive in a way I can almost hear," he said softly.
Patrick nodded, the faint rumble of his chest resonating with understanding. "Yes, but alive in silence, in patience, in subtlety. The ocean teaches that not everything important is loud or obvious. Sometimes the greatest lessons come in quiet places, through quiet noticing, and through trust in what cannot be seen." They spent hours exploring the pool, moving slowly among the rocks and coral. Patrick showed SpongeBob how to follow subtle currents that revealed hidden crevices, how to anticipate patterns of light and shadow, and how to sense the life flowing around them. SpongeBob's laughter was soft, careful, growing with wonder as he absorbed the rhythm of this deeper part of the ocean. Each discovery became a shared secret, a lesson whispered in the language of currents and light. Patrick noticed a faint shimmer near the pool's edge, a patch of soft, silvery sand disturbed by tiny bubbles. He gestured for SpongeBob to approach carefully.
he said softly.
Notice how the sand shifts with the current. Each ripple tells a story. Watch, feel, and let the lessons settle. SpongeBob leaned closer, tracing the bubbles with his fingers, sensing the invisible lines connecting movement, life, and flow. For a long moment they simply watched, letting the quiet magic of noticing fill them. As the sun began to lower, casting long beams of fading light into the pool, Patrick guided SpongeBob slowly back through the canyon and toward the familiar reef. The lessons of the deep waters lingered in their hearts, lessons of patience, attention, trust, and the subtle courage needed to follow paths unseen. The day had revealed more than hidden crevices and luminous life. It had deepened their understanding of the ocean, of each other, and of the quiet power of presence. Beneath his rock that night, Patrick let himself drift into the lullaby of the tides, SpongeBob's soft laughter and wide-eyed wonder echoing faintly in his mind. The deep pool had shown them a new dimension of the reef, one where attention and trust created their own quiet magic, and where even the smallest ripple could carry meaning far beyond what was seen. Patrick closed his eyes, carrying the gentle rhythm of currents, the laughter of his friend, and the infinite patience of the ocean itself into a deep, restful sleep. The morning light wavered softly through the water, brushing the reef in muted golds and greens. Patrick rose from beneath his rock with a calm that felt deeper than usual, as if the quiet lessons of the hidden grove and the deep pool had settled into his very being. The ocean hummed around him, currents gentle yet insistent, carrying a promise of new understanding. SpongeBob floated nearby, eyes wide and expectant, sensing the subtle shift in the tides. "Good morning, Patrick," the sponge said softly, voice mingling with the hum of water. "Are we going further today?" Patrick blinked slowly, letting the soft light ripple across his face. "Yes," he murmured. "The ocean has more to show us, and today we may notice connections we haven't seen before." They drifted slowly past familiar coral ridges, letting currents guide them with quiet patience. Every movement felt deliberate yet fluid, a dance of observation and trust. Patrick felt the faint pull of hidden paths, small eddies that whispered secrets through the water. SpongeBob mirrored his movements, slowly learning to sense the ocean's rhythm, to trust the subtle tug of currents that spoke of lessons waiting to be understood. As they moved beyond the known reef, the water deepened to a soft shade of blue, and shadows stretched and folded in ways that hinted at unseen structures below. Patrick's gaze lingered on a subtle glimmer, a line of bubbles rising from a hidden crevice.
"Do you see that?"
he asked, his voice calm, low. SpongeBob leaned closer, eyes tracking the gentle shimmer.
"It's delicate," he whispered.
"Like the ocean is breathing softly," Patrick nodded, drifting closer to the source. "Exactly. Life isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, fragile, and meaningful, only if you notice it carefully. These hidden patterns are the currents teaching us about connection, trust, and the subtleties of the world around us." They explored the crevice together, the narrow passage widening into a small alcove filled with delicate corals that glowed faintly under the filtered sunlight. Tiny fish moved among the branches in slow, deliberate patterns, as if performing a dance Patrick could feel but not name. The currents carried faint trails of bioluminescence, creating subtle ripples of light across the sand. SpongeBob reached out gently, allowing the water and life to brush against him, feeling the rhythm of connection between everything around them. "This place," SpongeBob murmured, eyes soft. "It feels like the reef is alive, but in a way that talks without words." Patrick smiled, the slow rumble of understanding vibrating through him.
"Yes, the ocean is always speaking."
It speaks in currents, patterns, whispers, and pauses. The more you notice, the more it reveals. And today, it's showing us how everything we've seen, the grove, the pool, the hidden edges, is connected. Patrick guided SpongeBob toward a cluster of coral arches, where small, luminescent creatures swirled together, creating faint trails of light in the water. He gestured for SpongeBob to pause, to watch, to notice the subtle choreography. Each movement was a lesson in harmony, in patience, in quiet attentiveness. SpongeBob's eyes widened, and he nodded slowly, feeling the invisible threads connecting fish, coral, water, and themselves. Hours passed in careful observation. Patrick showed SpongeBob how to anticipate gentle currents, how to sense patterns in the light and shadow, and how to let the rhythm of the reef guide their attention. Each discovery was like a whispered secret of the ocean, subtle, patient, transformative. SpongeBob laughed softly, a sound that blended seamlessly with the hum of the tides, and Patrick felt the quiet satisfaction of shared understanding. They came to a gentle slope of sand dotted with small, glowing anemones and soft, shifting shadows. Patrick paused, letting the currents cradle them both. "The ocean doesn't just teach us about the world outside," he said softly. "It teaches us about ourselves. How we notice, how we trust, how we move through life gently together.
And the connections we make.
Those are the currents that carry meaning beyond what we see." SpongeBob floated close, taking in the subtle dance of light, shadow, and movement.
"I think I understand now," he whispered. "It's not just about seeing or even feeling, it's about noticing everything."
And realizing it's all connected. Patrick nodded slowly, letting the words settle like soft sand. Yes, and when you notice together with someone you trust, it becomes something more than discovery. It becomes understanding, friendship, presence. And that, my friend, is the heart of the ocean's quiet magic. They lingered in the alcove until the sun began to dip, casting long, soft beams into the water. Patrick and SpongeBob drifted side by side, letting the currents carry them gently back toward the familiar reef. The lessons of the deep waters, the grove, and the hidden pool now intertwined, forming a subtle, invisible web of understanding, patience, and quiet courage. The reef felt larger, more alive, yet intimately connected, a living tapestry of life, trust, and attention. As evening settled, Patrick returned beneath his rock, letting the gentle lull of currents cradle him. SpongeBob drifted nearby, quiet and reflective, their shared presence weaving a soft, unspoken bond. Patrick felt the weight of the day settle into something calm and luminous, a quiet satisfaction, the resonance of understanding, and the gentle promise that the ocean always had more to teach for those willing to notice. Patrick closed his eyes, listening to the slow hum of the tides, SpongeBob's soft laughter echoing faintly in his mind. He felt the intricate currents of friendship, trust, and quiet discovery swirl around him like a gentle lullaby, carrying him into a restful, meditative sleep. The reef, the ocean, and their shared experiences were now threads woven into a tapestry of lessons and presence, subtle and infinite, and somewhere, in the quiet folds of the water, Patrick knew the tides were already preparing the next gentle whisper, the next lesson, the next reminder that even the softest currents could carry profound understanding. Morning light spilled softly through the water, painting the reef in hues of gold and green that seemed almost unreal in their gentle brilliance. Patrick rose from beneath his rock with a slow stretch, the ocean currents cradling him like an old friend. He felt a quiet resonance within himself, a sense of completion mingled with the anticipation of one last journey through the subtle wonders of the reef. SpongeBob was already there, hovering near the edge of the sandbank, his square eyes bright with that familiar mixture of curiosity and reverence. "Good morning, Patrick," he whispered, almost as if speaking too loudly might disturb the calm magic of the day.
"Are we ready?"
Patrick's smile was slow, warm, carrying a deep calm.
"Yes," he murmured.
"You've seen much, felt much, and learn much together. Today, we'll let the currents carry us, and let our hearts notice everything they brush against. The word everything floated gently in the water, as if it carried the weight of all their discoveries, all the lessons and all the quiet joys they had shared. SpongeBob's gaze softened, his breath slow, trusting the quiet rhythm of Patrick's presence. Together, they drifted into the open waters beyond the familiar reef, currents guiding them with gentle insistence. Shadows of coral stretched and twisted in shapes that seemed to speak in a language of light and shadow, a conversation only the attentive could follow. Patrick noticed subtle shifts in the water, faint ripples where life pulsed beneath the surface, the slow dance of tiny creatures weaving invisible threads across the sand, and the soft pulse of light that shimmered through the water like a delicate lullaby. "Do you feel that?" Patrick asked softly, floating close to SpongeBob. "It's the ocean itself speaking through its rhythms."
All the places we've seen, the grove, the hidden pool, the canyon, they are not separate.
They are threads in a tapestry, and today we see how they connect. SpongeBob's gaze followed the tiny currents swirling between the coral.
"It's beautiful," he murmured. Everything we've noticed."
"It all matters, doesn't it?" Patrick nodded, a warm rumble vibrating through him. "Yes, every current, every shadow, every soft ripple is part of the story, and we are part of it, too, not as observers only, but as participants, as friends who notice, who trust, who care." They drifted together through the reef, past familiar landmarks now imbued with new significance. The hidden grove shimmered faintly in their memories, the pool's soft luminescence lingering in Patrick's mind, and the canyon's quiet lessons still vibrating like a soft pulp. Patrick guided SpongeBob gently, pausing to let him notice small details. The way light fractured across a branching coral, the synchronized movement of a school of tiny fish, the whisper of a current against a smooth rock. Hours passed in slow, deliberate exploration. Patrick showed SpongeBob how to follow not just the obvious currents, but the subtle eddies, the invisible flows that connected one hidden place to another. SpongeBob laughed softly at the delicate dances of tiny creatures, his voice blending with the hum of the tides, a gentle echo in the quiet world around them. Patrick felt the joy of shared understanding, the deep, unspoken satisfaction of watching a friend grow in wonder and awareness. As the day wore on, the reef seemed to open itself fully to them, offering glimpses of its hidden depth and quiet wisdom. Patrick guided SpongeBob toward a gentle slope of sand where tiny luminescent anemones swayed, casting faint, moving patterns across the seabed. "This is a place of reflection," Patrick murmured.
"Not just to see, but to feel."
"And to remember. Everything we've discovered here, the laughter, the trust, the lessons, they all gather here in this quiet moment." SpongeBob settled beside him, eyes tracing the shimmer of light and shadow.
"I feel it," he said softly. "Like the reef is speaking."
"And I understand it just a little."
"All of it and us. All of it matters." Patrick reached out, letting a gentle touch rest on his friend's shoulder. "Yes, and this
This is why we notice together.
Friendship, care, attention.
They are currents as real as the water itself. They carry meaning beyond what we see, and they stay long after we float away." They drifted there in silence for a long time, letting the soft currents cradle them. Patrick felt a profound calm settle into his heart, the kind that comes when understanding and trust align, when lessons are absorbed, not just observed, and when connection, deep, unspoken, and gentle, becomes its own form of magic. SpongeBob's presence beside him was a reminder that joy could be simple yet infinitely deep, that noticing, patience, and care were gifts they had given each other and themselves. As the sun dipped lower, casting a final glow through the water, Patrick guided SpongeBob back toward the edge of the familiar reef. The ocean seemed to hum with approval, currents carrying them gently, as if acknowledging the journey they had taken together. Patrick lingered for a moment, feeling the reef, the grove, the pool, and the canyon all alive in memory, interconnected by the soft threads of attention, trust, and friendship. Beneath his rock that evening, Patrick let himself drift into the lullaby of the tides. SpongeBob floated nearby, a soft presence, a gentle reminder of the journeys they had shared and the lessons they had learned. Patrick felt the quiet joy of reflection, the satisfaction of discovery, and the deep, enduring magic of noticing, trusting, and caring. The reef, the ocean, and their friendship formed a tapestry of soft light and shadow, of subtle rhythms and delicate beauty. Patrick closed his eyes, letting the currents carry him into sleep. The gentle hum of water, the soft echo of SpongeBob's laughter, and the infinite patience of the ocean cradled him. And somewhere, in the quiet folds of the reef, he knew the tides would continue to whisper, teaching patience, attention, and quiet courage to anyone willing to notice. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's going to be okay, man.